Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Peter Moon. First, a couple of announcements. Check out our website, forbiddenknowledge.news. It's the home of the Forbidden Knowledge Network. That's where you find some of your favorite podcasts from our community, like Raised by Giants, Understanding Propaganda, With the Frick Live, Showtime with theCUBE, and more. Forbidden Knowledge News is always available on Rokfin, Odyssey, Rumble, and all podcast platforms. Our social media is Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Rokfin is where you can find our premium content, as well as all the premium content from every creator on Rokfin, and that's only $10 a month. You just go to rokfin.com/FKN+, that's ROKFIN.com/FKN+, and you can create a free account and get access to everyone's regular content. Today I want to welcome back to the show Peter Moon. He is an investigator and author of the Montauk Project, Transylvania book series, and the Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II, which we will be discussing today. He is also the proprietor of Online Time Travel Education Center and known for his investigation of space-time projects in association with scientist Preston Nichols. Peter, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. It's great to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. Today we're going to be discussing your latest book, written with Douglas Dietrich, The Roswell Deception and Demystification of World War II. It involves hidden masses of gold, hidden technology, massive psychological manipulation of the people, and profound revelations about the source of the Battle of Los Angeles and the Roswell crash. So this is fascinating, but it's been a while since you've been on. Peter, remind the audience just a little about your background and what led you to write this book.
Well, I'm mostly known for writing the Montauk Project Experiments in Time, which was published over 30 years ago in 1992. And of course, interesting thing about that book, I mean, that's about time experiments that took place at the end of Long Island, Montauk Point. And that book, which was immediately within 6 months, was purchased. The translation rights were purchased by the Japanese, then later by the Germans. And all the countries that have done my books have been Axis countries, meaning Japan, Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Spain, and Russia. Russia was a part of the Axis at one point, and Spain wasn't technically a member of the Axis, but for all practical purposes, it was. It was a neutral country, but it was a steadfast collaborator with the Axis, an ally. Mm-hmm. So it's only been the Axis countries. So when I ran into Douglas Dietrich, wow, I said, this is spectacular information that he has to release. And the information that he's released has been out there on the internet for 10 years, but it's like, there's such a resistance to the information, and everything in the book is steadfast and strong, and it's not really open to debate. So that's why how I came to write it.
Right on. Well, I guess what a good place to start would be, for the audience that's not familiar with Douglas Dietrich, could you tell us a little about him?
Well, he has a very interesting and unique cultural history. His mother was born into a royal lineage. She was part Chinese and part Japanese, and she was a prodigy. She could speak languages. She was gifted. She was fluent, and if she wasn't fluent in a language, she could learn it. So she spoke Chinese, she spoke Japanese, and she spoke German. And because she was of a royal lineage, she came to the emperor's attention, and he chose her to be an envoy to a Japanese, a translator for the Japanese envoy to Germany. So she was involved, became a translator for Hitler. So she had a very intimate knowledge of the political goings on in the Third Reich. She also was she knew the language of the original language of the Manchurians, which is not the same as Chinese or Mandarin or Japanese. So she could translate. So she was an integral part of the Manchurian dynasty in terms of being a go-to person. She also negotiated the talk-down talks between Japan and the United States. So she had inside knowledge, and she passed this on to Douglas. Douglas's father was equally unique. He didn't have a royal lineage, but maybe he did if you go back into the German ancestry, but he was American German. But he was joined the Navy about 16 or so, underage, and he was in on the river boat patrols in China before the actual war began, the war that we know as the war, and World War II. Yeah. And so he witnessed a lot of stuff firsthand of what the Japanese were doing in China, or what the Chinese and Americans were doing in China. So he had firsthand knowledge. He fought in at least 3 wars, being the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the World War II. So he had a very unique eye on Asia and history. That is a bit about his background. Now, he ended up, his father was in the Navy, and they went to San Francisco to be at the Presidio Army base because he could get benefits there that he couldn't get in other places. So they moved to San Francisco, and he ended up, through a series of events, becoming a Defense Department research librarian at the Presidio military base. Now, when you come into San Francisco from the north, meaning the Golden Gate Bridge from Marin County, the first thing you encounter, that bridge goes right onto the Presidio grounds. And when I would travel there as a young person, that way, basically on school trips, you saw the Presidio. I didn't even know what it was. I mean, I knew it was a place, but you could not go on the Presidio. You were forbidden to walk on there. Only recently, since Douglas had the base shut down, now can you now go on there and be a tourist because it's owned by Disney, but which is a whole long story. But anyway, the Presidio base takes up a huge part of the northern peninsula of San Francisco, and on this base was a Defense Department library where Douglas was assigned illegally to burn government documents, and burning these documents because it wasn't his job. So because the person who was supposed to do it got drunk, fell down into the incinerator, almost killed himself, had horrible burns. Nobody wanted to go down there for years. So when Douglas was assigned to the library, they said, "You're going to go down and burn these documents." Wow. And he protested, but he had no choice. They forced him to. So instead of just burning the documents, he read them. And he has a photographic memory. He would go home and take notes. He would draw pictures. There was only a few things he could safely smuggle out of there. And at one point, he was asked to collate all the information on the Roswell incident for the base commander. And that, not just the documents he burned, many of those, but that job of collating all the Roswell documents, he was are part and parcel of what's in this book. Not the documents themselves, but which he could not take, but the story behind them and how it all happened. So that's a bit of the background of Douglas Dietrich.
That's great. Now, where do you think we should start with this actual story? There's so many layers to this. Maybe we could start with Japan and the actual desired agendas that were going on behind the scenes there.
Well, I will start, with my own experience.
Sure.
Which is in the introduction or the foreword, is that as a young kid, my father would take me frequently to the Port of Los Angeles, because that's where I lived, and we would go fishing often there. And one day, and he explained to me the Japanese flags and all that, because there were many Japanese ships. But one day I saw, to my memory, is a Japanese ship with not the rising sun, but the war flag with all the rays going out of the rising sun. That was the Japanese war flag. And I said, "How come they have that flag?" And he says, "I don't know. I'll look into it." Now, when I remembered that, I dug up some photographs, a photograph of the Japanese war flags, they're on rather, what are these ships? They're not real heavy duty warships, a training squadron, but they have the war flag on them and they're in Los Angeles Harbor. That flag, I was always told, was forbidden. Now here they have war flags, and this is 1959. I was 6 years old.
Yeah.
So my memory is definitely correct, but it was a battleship I saw. It wasn't a little training ship. So there's three ships with three war flags that are in the forward. And so this told me that the Japanese were sending a message to the Americans. And there was a big incident that happened in 1959 between the Japanese and the Americans. And it seems to me there was a treaty of mutual cooperation and security between the US and Japan signed in 1960s that limited the power of the United States in the Far East. So in other words, the Japanese were saying, look at you guys, Americans, you're screwing up. We're putting our war flags out. Pay attention to us. And that shows that the Japanese had some leverage on the Americans. That's just a little incident from my life. But then when we move into I will give an opening statement. I'm not going to read the whole opening statement. The way I put this book together, because Douglas is the content provider, and I am the writer, editor, person who does the writing.
Right.
That's what I do. But so I said, I'm going to make this thing like an opening statement, like a lawyer would say in court. This is my opening statement. And the rest of the book is going to, you can read this book and you can be the judge and the jury at the end of the book.
Right.
Now, the opening statement is there are two major myths that have been perpetrated upon the world, particularly America, both of which have had an extremely negative impact with regard to understanding history as it really was and current events as they actually are. Elmer Davis and the Office of War Information had perpetrated an extensively false mythology that was created around actual circumstances and military facts of World War II. Now, Elmer Davis, you'll see him, he has a cameo role in the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still, when he's the reporter on the scene who's talking about the aliens landing on the mall, meaning the Green Grass Mall in Washington, D.C. Now, through the control of media outlets, including Hollywood, a myth has been created and successfully indoctrinated in the minds and routine thinking patterns of the population, convincing the public of the following. Myth number one: the Empire of Japan was an aggressor nation who attacked Pearl Harbor without provocation nor just cause, and further, as a direct result of atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Imperial Japan surrendered unconditionally, it being announced by Emperor Hirohito on August 15th and formally signed on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, thus bringing the hostilities of World War II to a close. This is a false myth that everybody believes. And the book disproves this, and we will address that in the course of our conversation. Myth number two: based upon a July 8th, 1947 press release from Roswell Army Airfield, Public Information Officer Walter Haut, the seeds of a myth were created when a story was circulated in the Roswell Daily Record that personnel from the field's 509th Operations Group had recovered a, quote, flying disc, quote, which had crashed on a ranch near Roswell. This included the report that Jesse Marcel had recovered a disc from the range lands of an unidentified rancher in the vicinity of Roswell, and that it had been flown to higher headquarters. That same story was reported, in that same story, it was reported the Roswell couple claimed to have seen a large identified object fly by their home on July 2nd. As a continuance of this myth and adding complexity to it, the July 9th Roswell Daily Record featured two headlines: Ramey empties Roswell saucer, and, quote, harassed rancher who located saucer, sorry he told about it. So there are more reports of this, quote unquote, UFO that landed in Roswell, with eyewitness accounts, retractable metal, hieroglyphics, accounts of yellowish orange or gray hairless bodies with 3 fingers being recovered near the crash that were placed in child-sized coffins. Eventually, this myth of aliens crashing at Roswell became institutionalized with an international UFO museum and research center at Roswell, with a public clamor created with a book called The Day After Roswell, written by Philip Corso and Bill Burns. And of course, the book deconstructs these myths, and I can address, but that's kind of the preamble, and I can give a further preamble of the deconstruction of these 2 myths that is also in the opening statement, much as a lawyer would do. He says, okay, these are the myths, and now I'm going to deconstruct these myths, and the deconstruction of these myths, that both of these myths are intricately woven together, so that Japan not only loses the war, but it ties into the Roswell incident. The war did not, okay, the deconstruction begins with, the war did not begin with Pearl Harbor. In addition to initiating and conducting a long-time policy of aggression against the Empire of Japan, the U.S. deliberately triggered hostility and an actual state of war against the Japanese as early as 1937 in order to protect the opium trade in China. This can all be documented. As opium was undermining the Chinese economy and the Japanese were trying to establish economic relations with China, the Japanese had interfered with the American-sponsored drug trade. The American response was to have their soldiers dress as Chinese coolies in blackened uniforms in order to instigate a guerrilla ambush against the Japanese during peace talks they were then having with the Chinese. Believing they were betrayed and that the ambush was generated by the Chinese themselves, the Japanese responded on December 9th, 1937, with what became known as the Rape of Nanjing, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths. There's books written on it. It's documentable. There's no question. Through interrogation of Chinese prisoners, it took the Japanese 72 hours to figure out that the instigators were Caucasians and not Chinese. Now, the Japanese didn't know whether it was the British or the Americans because it was just Caucasians, and the Chinese prisoners couldn't distinguish between the two. This resulted in the Japanese bombing the American ship Panay and Her Majesty's ship, the Lady Bird, on December 12th, 1937. This is in papers. The headlines are in the book with the actual pictures of the paper. This began an actual state of war between the Americans and the Japanese and was referred to as such. It was referred to as a war. It wasn't officially declared, but everybody talked about it by a war, and so did the newspaper. The Office of War Information, headed by Elmer Davis, suppressed the actual news, and the Congress did not declare war, because if the facts were revealed, it would badly embarrass the Americans to no end. The Pearl Harbor attack was a continuance of the already ongoing hostilities between the two countries, but it gave Roosevelt an ostensibly justifiable reason to declare war, all the time obfuscating the original cause. Now, the original cause, there was also an embargo on an economic embargo, including oil, on the Japanese, and they were going to run out of oil. So they were being squeezed by the Americans because the Americans wanted the Japanese to capitulate to them. The very successful Pearl Harbor attack in December 7th, 1941, was followed up 2 months later when Japanese dirigibles, super dirigibles, invaded the airspace of Los Angeles on February 25th, 1942, triggering a massive panic in both the population and the military. The Japanese strategy was not to bomb LA, but to frighten the American military brass into believing they were going to infect the American population with biocidal weapons of mass destruction. The Army responded with massive artillery fire, drowning some of the Japanese aircraft, and fast action was taken to truncate any reports of a Japanese attack. Initial reports couldn't really fool anybody, but the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, attributed the American response to a case of war nerves, because everybody knew they were shooting shells, airplanes were coming down, with no actual attack having taken place. He said it was war nerves, and there was no aircraft present. As the president and the military had good reason to believe that Emperor Hirohito and the Japanese were experimenting with yellow fever as a biocidal weapon, which they knew from China. The Japanese were using biocidal weapons in China. They correctly assumed that he was incorrectly assumed, because they weren't putting any biological weapons into LA. They assumed that he was releasing such on the population. Accordingly, they created an instant and erroneous vaccine, which killed 50,000 of their own men. And hepatitis, and infected another 350,000 who had to be mustered out of the service because they were unfit for combat, eventually dying years later. So Hirohito had literally kicked the hell out of the Americans, both at Pearl Harbor and in Los Angeles. He got them to kill their own men.
And we blamed UFOs.
Well, they blamed UFOs because this is a very embarrassing, and this is still a big point of contention or a point of hiding to this day. Bill Clinton went to lengths to hide this information. But the superdirigibles, which had originally been developed to access the otherwise inaccessible hill country of China, consisted of one huge hydrogen balloon surrounded by smaller 9 balloons. Now, these were hydrogen, which is very flammable, a lift capacity of 250 tons. They were capable of carrying small planes, which were, kind of hung upside down and put on a row like a Peking duck, and mini tanks, and we have a picture of the mini tanks, as well as troops. The typical operators were small in stature, often not greater than 4 feet. These were the Yakuza, whose tradition includes the severing of the pinky finger in order to atone for their sins. They are the lowest class, criminal class of Japan. They were loyal to the emperor. They cut off their pinky fingers. So you have these little guys who had shaved all their hair off operating these dirigibles. They were specially trained to do it. And so anyway, to fast forward, because this is still part of the opening statement, during the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were no military targets because the Japanese military in its entirety was on the Asian mainland because they'd already successfully invaded China, and they weren't sitting there like on the Japanese island. It took only a matter of days for the Japanese to respond by sending superdirigibles to cross the Pacific. This is 3 days after Hiroshima. And there's this Kuroshio or Japanese current, Kuroshio current, that runs up the north coast of Japan, goes across the top of the Pacific Ocean, south of Alaska, comes down Canada, and will come right down the coast all the way to California. And that current is so strong and so consistent that he could send a dirigible. It's going to get there in 3 days. It's not going to take long at all. And he sent 3 of dirigibles, and they were traveling on this current, and they were going to go to Tonopah Army Airfield in Nevada. It's an area we now know today as Area 51, where they had advanced aircraft. 2 of them landed in the area of Area 51. Another one crashed, which is a whole other story. The Yakuza were treated as prisoners of war. And despite protracted peace negotiations that took place from August 6th and extended all the way to 1951, the presence of these soldiers was never officially or otherwise acknowledged by the U.S. And it's a war crime to this day, still extant. The superdirigibles actually included biocidal weapons of mass destruction, but they were not unleashed. They were sent as a threat. Hirohito was showing the aeronautical capabilities and the biocidal capabilities to induce the Americans into accepting his terms for peace, which he had been asking for peace for the entirety of the year. And what because the Americans insisted that the emperor would not be left on his job. They unconditional surrender. And he had been suing for peace, saying, we don't want to fight you people. All we want is your markets open, and we want the emperor to stay on his job. And on August 15th, they accepted. So there was a lot of charades being played to make the people think and make everybody think. He insisted on Douglas MacArthur to be his, he was called the emperor's puppet, to come to Japan and, rehabilitate them, he was doing everything the emperor wanted because he had a history in the Orient. So on 1951, a treaty of peace known as the Treaty of San Francisco was signed between Japan and the United States. The treaty itself went into effect on the emperor's birthday, April 25th, 1952, April 28th, rather. It was a day of celebration for the Empire of Japan because the economic doors of the West were now wide open to them, a prospect which was denied to them prior to the war. The United States then having sought a colonization under threat of strangulation policy against the Japanese. Now, peace negotiations continued well after this so-called surrender aboard the Missouri. President Truman can be seen on video declaring an official end of the hostilities on the last day of 1946. You can see this on YouTube. He says, the end of hostilities.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, the Americans were seeking to operate the superdirigibles for their own purposes because they wanted to go down and beat the Germans in Antarctica, who had sent Admiral Byrd in early 1946 back home because he went down there to invade Antarctica and get rid of the last Nazi strongholds, which he couldn't do because they had superior flying craft. So he went back with his tail between his legs, and he wasn't actually the war admiral. He was the, he was the PR head. He wasn't a war admiral. They had other people to do that, but nevertheless, he was billed as the exploit. Was an exploration? They called it an exploration, which he was an explorer, but it was actually a military mission, which didn't work. So the Americans thought they could take this Japanese craft and go down there, and it was a stupid idea. But anyway, they tried to do it. They were going to go down and bomb the Germans or beat the Germans and get rid of that German last holdout. There wasn't their last holdout, but it was one of them. So, but the American soldiers couldn't operate these dirigibles. They were too big. So they tortured the Yakuza, the little Japanese, forced them to experiment with the craft on behalf of the American agenda. Now, during test flights, well, I should say some of these Japanese escaped in these small planes. They were called the Zimmer Skimmer. They were an American design that the Japanese had purchased and modified. They went pretty fast. Not fast like your typical flying saucer, but they were going fast. They were witnessed by Kenneth Arnold over Washington State, and they were described as flying saucers. This was just a couple weeks before the Roswell incident, and they were cited as called flying saucers. Now, he posed in a picture. He did what the government wanted them to do, and so that became the first use of the word flying saucer. Then Roswell happens a couple weeks later or so, and they were doing flight trials over the Four Corners region. Winds had blown the craft towards Roswell, and the Yakuza had already planned to self-immolate because they didn't want continued imprisonment and torture from the Americans. So they blew up their own ship, which wasn't hard to do considering it was hydrogen.
Yeah.
And it blew up. It landed near Roswell. Some of the Yakuza survived. And there are stories of people seeing what looked like Japanese or Asians. The government, the army was waiting for them because they knew. And they did this great PR maneuver where they cut the craft and then they made an incident out of it to make it sound like it was aliens. The alien thing went back to the Battle of Los Angeles, where the people would come up and the army were trained to say, "Oh, that was aliens." it was technically aliens in the sense that they weren't Americans, but it wasn't extraterrestrials. In order to avoid complete embarrassment, the government sought a strict policy of containment and demonstrated it with an iron fist, never hesitating to threaten the lives of witnesses and their families. So they did the press release, announced that, it was, and then for years after they said, well, it was a weather balloon. So they're obviously, everybody thinks they're lying when they say it's a weather balloon because they are lying.
Yeah.
And so it makes people, the government's hiding. So it creates this alien-inspired subculture to the point where the myth has created a closely cherished staple of the UFO. It's been a closely cherished staple of the UFO community and the American public in general.
Yeah,
it's a shrine in America, and it's all based on BS. Another thing with regards to my interest in this, the Roswell book, that one by Philip Corso, what is it called? The Day After Roswell.
Yeah.
I said, I just knew it was crap when it came out, and it was cutting across all of my sales. I was getting a lot of attention then. It took everybody's attention off to Roswell. And now here it is, years and years after all of this, and I get an answer. It was nothing I protested against publicly. But, people were going to this Roswell museum and all this. It's like, okay. So that's the opening statement. And if you read the book, you'll get all the substantiation that.
Right now is the most critical time for us to take back control of our food supply and become self-reliant by having our very own food forest. Transform your yard into a food forest and create a system of self-reliance that's easy and enjoyable with our friends at Food Forest Abundance. No matter where you're starting from, you can become more self-reliant. You can take your self-reliance to the next level by becoming a producer of your own food through growing and foraging. Learn how to turn your property into an income-producing source of economic self-reliance. If you're ready to go off-grid, click the link in the description and use coupon code FORBIDDEN for discounts on your very own food forest with Food Forest Abundance. Wow, man. Well, Peter, one of the saddest parts of this to me is we have dedicated UFO researchers in the community that are still going to conferences, still writing books, that still swear by the Roswell incident. And it's a foundational misnomer. It's a foundational problem with this community that it's all based on BS.
I'm glad you recognize that because, look, you're younger and you're not attached to this myth. Younger people are not attached to Roswell at all. But it's this older generation, my generation, that grew up with it. And there's a big problem. And I noticed this with teaching Qigong and learning Qigong, which is an Asian art as well, which I've studied for, over a decade. And the problem is people have egos. So if they've been doing something all their life that's wrong, if they've been listening to teachers with false or bad information, if they've been breathing their whole life bad, by the time you've gotten to 40, 50 years old or more, you think you know things. And the ego has to accept that it's been wrong. And once you can accept that you're not right about everything, the door opens. So some of these UFO researchers are just, they're stuck and they're not learning anything more. And it just keeps churning around like a squirrel in a cage.
Yeah. It's
like, when is the government going to release the alien? They had last year, when this book was released last year, there was disclosure that even Fox Business News was saying, or Fox News, whatever it was, they were saying there's disclosure. The government's going to start releasing files. Then this book came out and the government didn't release anything. Anything it released was really not substantial. So it's like, okay, here's the information, but we're not going to talk about this. And there has become right now, the United States is an icon, or what do you call it? It's suffering from iconoclastism, where they're tearing down all these statues. They're
Yeah.
tearing down all these staples of American history and American culture, statues of, Thomas Jefferson with George Washington, this sort of thing. Now, but what they don't tear down is the false iconography of Roswell. And this is an American staple. They don't tear down the fact that the United States has been lying. The Office of War Information became the CIA, or became part of the CIA. So they're perpetrating these false myths. So all of this insurgency you see is a false insurgency. It's a controlled insurgency. They're not tearing down the true staple of American bullshit.
Yeah, it's also so sad that one of the seemingly largest victories we've had as a country throughout our modern history, World War II, is mostly based on falsehoods and farcities, and we're finding out more and more about them every day from brilliant researchers like yourself. And I want to go back to Hiroshima for a second. Based on all the other falsehoods that came out of World War II, do you think that there is something different about the atom bomb narrative that we should know about?
Oh, tremendous. I mean, the book goes into that quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's even deeper aspects to the bomb, which I just, which gets very occult. And I won't really go into that because it's but anyway, the atomic bomb itself, the first one that was dropped, which was known as Little Boy, it was not an American bomb. It was a German bomb. The Germans had actually unleashed an atom bomb in October of 1944 in Courland, a part of Latvia, where it was used as a deterrent to the Russians, who were trying to invade the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Germans considered these to be Germanic nations that had been part of the Teutonic Knights for thousands of years, and they had many German nationals there. So a Polish general, in his own admission to war crimes, told about his help with developing the atomic bomb and its development and eventual deployment at Courland. There was an additional affidavit released during the Clinton administration, which concerned the interrogation of a Luftwaffe test pilot who provided evidence that the Third Reich tested an atomic bomb via a large cruise, what was a primitive cruise missile. It ignited a mushroom cloud on the Baltic coast that was a full kilometer in diameter, and it extended from Berlin, could be seen, electrical interference from Berlin to Great Britain. Now, despite the initial success of the German atomic bomb, which was successful in 1944, medical doctors explained to Hitler that radiation inflicted cellular level damage. This is first time in history an atomic weapon had been deployed in modern history. There's stories of it being applied thousands of years ago, but we're not going to go there. The German medical community was able to identify that radiation does not behave like a virus, and that a cell cannot fight off radiation with antibodies. So Hitler was obsessed with biological analogies. He viewed this warfare was like something that would destroy the Aryan race. And he did not want to employ it because this is going to destroy the genetic viability of Aryan man. So he says no matter what happened, he would never again employ atomic weapons on the continent of Europe. They also looked at them as to tactical weapons, not strategic weapons, which is what the Americans turned them into. So this was the original bomb that happened, or they had the bomb. Now, at the end of the war, because the Germans did lose the ground war in Europe, there's no disputing that. The Americans basically what they did, they sent Charles Lindbergh over to get this bomb. Lindbergh was hated by FDR. He hated FDR. I mean, FDR hated him. He was pro-German from prior to the war, but he was a great pilot. So FDR had him sent out to Asia, where he fought in Asia. When the war in Germany ended, they brought Lindbergh back, and he went and retrieved the bomb because he could negotiate with the Germans. He talked to the Germans, and a arrangement was worked out so that Lindbergh could go retrieve it. And I don't remember what they gave the Germans in return for that, but it was, they were bartering paperclip scientists. They were bartering this and that, even though the war had been, the Germans, it was not the German body politic who surrendered. It was not the German people. It was not the German government. It was the German military. And that was a big issue, because in World War I, it was the German government that had sold the Germans down the river. The German military was strong, and they resented what so the Americans realized they didn't deal with the German military. So this time they did the military, but they didn't do the Third Reich. The Third Reich was the duly elected, legally recognized government of the German people, and it's still at war to this day because it's still there. But that's another story for another book.
Yeah.
But anyway, the bomb that ended up at Hiroshima was the German bomb. It was a standardized piece of atomic ordnance that's developed by the Axis, who had dozens of these bombs. And the Germans did develop them. The Truman, when he took over after Roosevelt, he was happy to recall Lindbergh. So Truman assigned Lindbergh to deal with as many Nazi scientists and technicians as he could to bring back the bomb. Now, of course, the Americans ended up working with the Germans in New Mexico, which is where the bomb was. So the bomb was never tested. But it's distinctly, this initial bomb that went on Hiroshima was different than the bomb that was later tested at Trinity, which was a plutonium bomb. And that was called Fat Man. So they're two different bombs. Fat Man is August 9th. Little Boy is August 6th. So this is, now there are more information about the bomb, but when we get back into Korea, which is now North Korea, was where the Japanese, I'll just digress here. The Japanese, before the war, Hirohito had invaded the entirety of Asia, and he took all the gold, huge amounts of gold. He confiscated gold from Thailand, Burma, Vietnam, you name it. He had all the gold because he had the soldiers. So with all this gold, it was incredible wealth. Now, in addition to that, he had cash. At the end of the war, and this is from an outside source, he had $100 billion in Swiss banks. This is Hirohito.
Yeah.
So he was the richest man in the world. He could finance his own military, and he was always portrayed as a kindly old guy who was taken advantage of. This was very far from the truth. Now, there is a Atlanta Constitution article that is featured in the book, that says Japan developed atom bomb, Russians grabbed scientists. There was also the Canberra Times, an Australian paper, 28 November 1950, that talked about the Konan complex in Korea. The Konan complex is where the Japanese developed the bomb. So you've got it even in newspapers that all of this story is this great, powerful weapon that the Americans had. It's just a false narrative.
Yeah.
But it's worked.
It certainly has. Now, when you first started talking about this, you mentioned there were some occult aspects behind this. I'd love to get into that a little bit if you could.
I can't go into it too deeply because I don't have the full story. However, what I can tell you is that Leslie Groves was the guy who was behind the building. He was the of the atomic bomb, or the certainly the getting all the scientists. And there was a lot of according to Douglas, he was a devout Satanist, but the actual breaking ground for the Pentagon, that he was in charge of building things. He started they did the shovel ceremony for the Pentagon. It was on September 11th. I think it was 1941 or 4. I forget the date, but it was like September 11th. Like, that date doesn't appear to be a coincidence. Right. So the whole atomic bomb was to breed chaos. And these were scientists like Oppenheimer, who belonged to satanic, in fact, it might even be worse than Satanism.
Right.
It's called chaos. In the Bible, they're called the kings of Edom. They were the natural enemies of what would be the Israelites, and they were just to breed chaos. And that's what they were there to do. They've usurped the Judaic religion as well. So everything gets very colored and queer and weird, but it goes very deep. And it's like that wasn't really the province of this book, but it will probably be covered in the future. Right now, I'm working with Douglas to present a overview, a compendium, which might be a one-man show that's like a couple hours long, that goes into his whole history, with which the Roswell book is just a piece of. If he did his well, this Roswell book would have been at least twice the size and probably 4 times the size. Yeah. But economically, no, it's got to stop. It's like there's enough information here. He'll go to the nth degree to establish, but people don't have time, especially when we live in a Twitter culture that a paragraph is too long.
Now, given that so much of the foundations of our modern UFO history is false, what do you think is happening since especially 2017 with New York Times article, and then on to Pentagon departments researching UAPs, and now they're possibly saying, oh, these may not even be human-driven crafts. So what does that mean for all of this stuff that's going on now? I never trusted it to begin with, but I'd like to get your thoughts.
Well, this is an elaborate campaign to, deceive the public and to keep them thinking and guessing. They never deliver anything. And if they would admit to this, it's like an addict who won't admit he's addicted. Or it's like somebody who has done a horrible crime against, you or his group or his family, and he won't admit what he's done. It's a form of denial in addiction lingo. The government and all of the people enabling it need to be put on a 9-step program, like Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the truth. It's like they're all liars, because we know that the politicians are all liars. They've caught the president lying his ass off. It doesn't, but nobody does anything about it. So the press enables the lies. The press secretaries, it doesn't matter which administration you are, they get up and they lie. They're there to lie on behalf of the president. And so we have a culture of liars. So this is the problem. So when it gets to the subject of UFOs, why don't we admit what really happened?
Right.
They're not going to admit it. And even when they do, okay, we're going to be transparent about UFOs. There are UAPs, unacknowledged aerial phenomena. Well, of course there are. anytime you look up and can't tell what it is, it's a UAP. It's a UFO. They changed the name because we're going to sanitize it.
Yeah.
And it's just, and meanwhile, this was all kind of like accelerated when this book came out. So it's like, I'm a person who has been known about in newsrooms for 30 years, and the instructions are, don't mention him, don't mention him, don't mention him. And I can't see who my enemies are. But now it's 30 years later. My Montauk Project story has been sort of grandfathered into legend / history, urban legend. But now this stuff, the people that were hiding this information were the same people that were hiding my information. Now, I have some friends in the Disclosure Network who were badly embarrassed they were set up by some person in Intel or whatever.
Yeah.
But they had told me it was privately, I don't think it was really secret, but they had talked to people supposedly in the know when they were down in DC that said, because they came from a government family, they said that these, that there was too many dead bodies. And this is why they wouldn't reveal the stories about UFOs. There's too many dead bodies connected. Well, who are these dead bodies? It's very obvious that the dead bodies are all these dead bodies going back to World War II. That the United States has been guilty of war crimes, but war crimes against its own people. And this is just, it's easy for us to sit back and say these all were a bunch of jerks and they were liars. However, when you get to admitting the truth, like say, suppose you had committed a crime that was a murder, suppose I know of somebody like this. He's probably in his 60s in Romania. He's 60 years old and he supposedly killed somebody like when he was young. He went to America, he came back to Romania after communism fell, and he's a murderer. Everybody kind of knows he's a murderer. And he's trying to make it up by doing good deeds. Now, in other words, if the story's true, I know the man. He never told me this. I just found this out about him. He killed somebody, but he's still living with that. He's living with the guilt. Now, when we actually have the government admitting that they did this, now it's not the same people. Like, Kissinger is one of the most powerful people in the industrial complex.
Yeah.
He didn't do this stuff. He probably knows about it. And his hands might be bloody on other things. But the thing is, there's so much blood that when you actually begin to acknowledge that you killed somebody, there's hell to pay. There's guilt to pay. There's consequences, because all of a sudden the dominoes start falling. Now, when we see the United States falling to pieces over certain issues that are happening right now geopolitically, this puts a different inertia on it. It's top heavy, but the United States doesn't have to fall apart. The United States can operate quite fine if the Constitution and the laws are followed. The problem is not the laws. The problem is the people who are not enforcing the laws and manipulating the laws. So these people have to fall down. And we're living in astrological times when there will be some severe shakeouts in this next decade, this of the 20s.
Now, do you think that we actually have advanced craft that have been reverse engineered from some unknown source? I mean, you mentioned that the Nazis kind of kicked Admiral Byrd's ass out of Antarctica with the craft that they had. Well, where did they get this technology? What are your thoughts on that? Well,
there is a place that's actually disappeared on maps. Marcus Island, known as Monster Island. A lot of this reverse engineered craft, if it is indeed reverse engineered craft and not purchased, is from the Japanese and sometimes from the Germans. The Germans have very advanced craft. And that's addressed in my book, The Black Sun.
Right.
The Marcus Island is one of the most enigmatic and overlooked historical aspects of World War II. It's known as Monster Island. It's just under 1,000 miles from Tokyo. Now, its name is Minamotorishima. It's called Monster Island because it's the site of development and of unconventional weapons with maximum threat projection. Americans call it Marcus Island. It was a test bed for revolutionary prototype technologies, some of which you have read about or read about in the book. It's Japan's Area 51, but it's much more advanced and it's on an island. It's like the distance between that and Tokyo is like from New York to Florida, more or less. So this atoll was attacked violently and repeatedly by the Americans, the first coming in March 1942. So March 42 is just a couple weeks or less. It's less than a couple weeks after the Battle of Los Angeles. The USS Enterprise does the Marcus Island raid. It was a primary target of Jimmy Doolittle's raid in June of the same year, but it didn't work. No less than four. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you think that that the original engineering of these crafts was just by advanced human, just by the Japanese, and not necessarily from off-planet or extraterrestrials?
There was no need for extraterrestrials. Where we do have, in the German case, we have Rudolf Hess, who was a member of the Vril Society. He was known to give long and involved lectures on aerodynamics of advanced craft. He, when he was in prison, the German scientists would write to him. And he held his own. He was not known as a scientist, but he held his own. But the Vril crafts were originally, allegedly, they had scientists working on them, but they were inspired by these Vril mediums who channeled, they said, from, what was it, Aldebaran. And some of the technology was done that way. But it wasn't necessarily aliens. It was coming from a, outside source, but it was scientists who put it together.
Yeah.
And there was a famous Romanian scientist, Henry Coanda, of which the airport in Bucharest is named after, Coanda Airport. He could not figure out, he created the Concorde, the French plane. He couldn't figure it out until he went to Tibet. And they told him to put intent into his device. They told him to put intent, he could do it. So they had demolition teams in 1943, frogmen trying to get underneath Marcus Island, but they couldn't do it. And then the status of the island after World War II had a very odd status, and they kind of didn't mention anything that was underneath because there was huge cavities in the coral, which the Japanese had further expanded. So there was this huge underground complex there. So that's there's so much history that is just not talked about or acknowledged by the UFO community, that the UFO community cannot even be taken seriously. They're just being led on a string.
Man, we're living in such incredible times. I am extremely concerned about the future of historical documentation and education, because we're already seeing, of course, the history that we've been taught is mostly factual in many aspects already, but now we're seeing an erasing of our modern history that we were just recently involved in, and it makes me completely scared that they're going to alter everything we know about all of our history, and that our future generations won't know where the hell they came from.
Well, you could kind of say that about life anyway. Do we really know where we came from? Like, say, I go back, I know very little about my grandparents. I know something about them, but it's not extensive. And, I only know about my parents from what they've told. So if I go back to great-grandmothers, I know nothing about them. So what the hell do I know about anything? That's just with regards to family. If we're talking about history, we have what people write down. One of the great historians of the things are based on is Josephus. Josephus writes the history of the first century. But if you read the work of Ralph Ellis, you will see how tainted his whole career is. So what do we really, how politically calculating it was. The history of Alexander the Great is very mistold. Douglas Dietrich's gone into that in detail. So the history we have is kind of flaky. And it's inaccurate because it's only one version. And then you have intelligence agencies which have, written false histories.
Yes.
Deliberately written false. So we're already living in a, zone of unknownness. I mean, you can assume that a lot of the history is told reasonably accurate, but there's a whole occult history and stuff that goes with all of these monarchs and governments, and they don't tell the real history, like what's buried in the Vatican, this sort of thing. So we've always been living under that, and we haven't, one of the ways I learned or was guided into history would be watching a movie, particularly religious history of the Christian era. I'd watch these movies that were, looking back on them, were very hokey, of the Christian era. My favorite one, I think it's called The Robe. Not that it's my favorite movie, but this incident from The Robe where the Christians are being eaten by lions, or they allude to it. They don't show it, I don't think. But of course, the lions, historically, I've read that the lions didn't eat Christians. It didn't work that way. That's a myth. But whatever the case is, in the movie, the lions are eaten by the Christians, but they have smiles on their faces because they're going to a higher place and they're not afraid to die. Well, look, that may be true, but anybody eating by a lion is not going to have, or killed, is not in a gladiator pit, is not going to be smiling.
Yeah.
It's not physiologically consistent. So they're conveying the idea that these Christians are smiling, and it's stupid.
Right. It's
stupid because they're giving you an idea. I mean, the idea is okay, that they're not afraid to die and that they're going to go to a higher place. So, history, but this is sort of my introduction to, history of the first century, watching that movie and taking, what really happened back there? Who's this character called Caligula? Now, Caligula has been history to death since then, but back in those days, nobody talked about Caligula. So this is, history is, I think what I liked about movies of a historical time period, they get you interested in the time period, and then you can go back and read the history. But now we know much of that history isn't even accurate. So all we can do is hope that maybe the time machine can bring us something. And of course, Douglas Dietrich has read history like a savant in secret history, and he can tell it like nobody else can, in terms of, especially when it comes to Asia or the Axis powers, which we'll be working on more things in the future.
Well, this is fantastic, Peter. We're definitely going to have to talk again soon. Before you head out, let the audience know where they can find the book, and if you have a website, all your social media, all the good stuff.
Okay, skybooks.usa.com is where you can get the book, The Roswell Deception. skybooks.usa.com. You can also get it on Kindle, and you can buy it off of Amazon as well, if you prefer to do that. And we also have a website, the timetraveleducationcenter.com, the timetraveleducationcenter.com, which is on my work about time travel. So look, it was great being with you. Thank you for acknowledging this book. It's very important. And
Yes.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. We'll definitely be talking again in the future. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. See you then.